Welcome to day 9 of our daily Bible reading. Today we've got Genesis chapter 23 to 24 and Luke chapter 9. Sarah passes away in our Genesis reading today, and we have a pretty long story about what Abraham does in order to bury Sarah. There are some ritual stuff going on that doesn't mean a whole lot to us. He's adamant that he wants to buy land for her burial tomb. I don't think we need to worry about the ins and outs of the Jewish ritual traditions around burial that are included in this passage, but I do think it's important for us to recognize the honor, the deep honor that Abraham has for his wife, and that he wants to give his wife as he is going through the process of remembering and celebrating her life and preparing her body for burial. And I think this is something that we can remember today. A lot of us try to avoid thinking about death, and many of us try to put off planning for our own deaths or for the deaths of loved ones as long as possible. But Abraham shows us that being faithful to God and being faithful to the important people in our life also includes being faithful to them and their lives as we prepare their bodies for burial. Looking at Luke chapter 9, Jesus is now sending his followers out on their own journeys to share the teachings of Jesus and to heal people. We read last time about a lot of the journeys that Jesus was taking with his followers, and Jesus is intentionally training them and teaching them. And here he goes and he's sending them out. Now, overall, Luke has about 24 chapters, and we're in chapter 9, so we're pretty early in the story of Jesus. And I bring this up because here Jesus is sending his followers out 2 by 2 in small groups to go and start being Jesus, doing the work that he is doing. We've talked about how disciples try to become the rabbi. And here, they've only been with Jesus maybe a few months, maybe a year, maybe 18 months. It hasn't been that long, and he is already sending them out. Now, he collects them back together. He debriefs them. They talk about how things went or how things didn't go. But they go out and they start doing what Jesus did. And for those of us who are interested in learning more about Jesus and following in the way of Jesus, we also need to accept that Jesus is sending us out, and that Jesus is probably sending us out before we feel ready to go out and do the same work that Jesus was doing. Now, at one point, the crowd is following. Jesus keeps on teaching, and it's a huge crowd, thousands of people. And eventually his followers, his disciples are like, we've got a problem. You got to send everyone away. People are getting hungry and there's no food in sight. Instead of sending people away, Jesus uses the opportunity to have his disciples ask around and say, hey, does anyone have anything? And a kid's got some loaves of bread and a couple fish. Jesus blesses this, and he starts handing it out in baskets. And as his followers are walking through the crowd, handing this out, there is plenty for everyone. In fact, there's 12 baskets of leftovers. So the stuff that's left over after this meal is more than what they started with, not even counting everything that filled the bellies of everyone involved. One of the things for us to remember here is that our God is a God of abundance. And when we're sitting around whining that we don't have what we need for whatever it is that Jesus is telling us to do, remember at the beginning of this chapter, Jesus told people, go and do my work. Don't take anything along. Don't worry. Just as you go, be fed by the people you meet. Welcome the hospitality that you are given. And, if you show up someplace and no one wants to support you, just move on. Keep going on. In verse 23, Jesus goes on to say, if you want to walk the road with me, each day you must be ready to give up your own life and carry your crossbeam with me to the place of ultimate sacrifice. Walking with Jesus is not easy. This is not the easy way through life. There are some preachers who are like, if you have fantastic faith, everything's going to be fine in your life. Jesus does not say that. Jesus says that there will be a cost to the grace that we receive. Jesus freely gives us this grace, and we don't have to do anything to earn the grace. But once we've received the grace and we are living as Jesus lived, there may be times when we will be asked to make sacrifices in order to love our neighbor as Jesus loved our neighbor. This may look different for each one of us, and some of us may have lives that are more comfortable than others of us. As we look around the world right now, it is not fair how some people are facing terrible wars and battles and oppression and injustice, while other people have very comfortable lives. But as I think about the impact of Hurricane Helene this week, I think that the issue of climate change is one that more and more of us need to accept is real and that we have a part in dealing with it. We have a whole bunch of neighbors who are struggling after the terrible impacts of Hurricane Helene. Now, there were hurricanes long before climate change, but the hurricanes that we are having now sometimes are getting stronger, faster. They're hitting a bigger area. They're coming more often. It looks like there's more storms developing in the Gulf of Mexico right now. It is clear that our climate is not what it was. We have just had some of the hottest days in October ever recorded in North America. And so perhaps some of the sacrifice we need to be considering that Jesus is asking us to experience right now is, what is the sacrifice to care for both the earth and our neighbors, including our neighbors who are in future generations who may not even be born yet? There are some things that each one of us can do. They are small things, but when all of us do them, they do combine to make a big impact. Each of us can decide to start cutting back some on the meat that we eat. Meat is one of the major contributors to carbon in our atmosphere through agricultural practices. We can change appliances and switch to appliances such as electric induction stoves and more energy efficient washing machines. Maybe we use our dryers less and go old school and have our clothes dry on a line again. As we continue in the story of Jesus, we have this transfiguration story where a few of the disciples have gone up a mountain with Jesus. And of course, they fall asleep because they're always falling asleep while Jesus goes off to pray. But when they wake up, they notice that there is a vision of Moses and Elijah standing with Jesus on top of this mountain. Now, Peter's immediate reaction is, oh, let's build a temple. Let's build an altar. Let's stay up here and let's remember this glorious moment. And Jesus is pretty clear, this is not the point. It had to have been an incredible thing to see Moses and Elijah there speaking to Jesus. And perhaps God sent them down to encourage Jesus. This had to have been a difficult time in his ministry. Jesus knew that he was going to die. Jesus knew that he would be making the ultimate sacrifice at the end of his time of ministry on earth. And for the disciples to get a vision of this meeting of these great prophets with Jesus was truly amazing. But Jesus says to them, go back. You have to go back down the mountain. You do not get to stay up here. This is not where community is. This is not where our ministry is. This is not where God's kingdom will be built. Go back and live in community. Share the message of God's love with all of your neighbors. And we then have this little thing about who's first, who's last, who gets welcomed. And Jesus says we welcome kids and we welcome outcasts. And I think the question for us at the final section of this chapter is, how are we welcoming kids in our churches and people who have been outcast in our communities? Now, a lot of our churches talk a lot about wanting to have family and kids and youth at our churches, but a lot of us have worship services that are still very focused on the adults and the senior citizens and their personal preferences in worship. A lot of us have scheduled the meetings of the church and the activities of the church more so for the people who are retired and are no longer working and want to meet during the day, and we are putting together fewer and fewer activities that fit the schedules of family and youth. And I think this is a real place to challenge ourselves. Just how are we set up to welcome children in our churches? How are we including youth in the leadership of our churches? A lot of people say youth are the future of the church. I would argue the youth are the church today. And when we don't put them into leadership, when we don't have them help us plan stuff, when we don't let them take charge and step back, then I think we are not following in the way of Jesus, where he lets the children come first and sit on his lap for his teachings. Once again, challenging teachings from Jesus. We'll see you next time.